you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Interim Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with faith leaders, environmental practitioners, and academics to talk about all the things at the intersections of the environment, climate change, faith, and the social justice issues of our time. And today we have a very special guest, Jesse Demonbreun-Chapman, the Executive Director and Riverkeeper of the Coosa River Basin Initiative, or CRBI. Thanks, Jesse, for joining us this morning.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Cody.
Yeah, so to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up getting into environmental work and eventually to Coosa River Basin?
Sure. I think like most people that grew up in Georgia, I spent just a ton of my childhood wandering around in the woods and playing in creeks, and that never really left me. When I went to college, I went to Berry and was particularly attracted to Berry because of the just absolutely enormous campus, where, you know, there was just tons to explore and mountain bike and all over, you know, all kinds of cool things to check out. And so I ended up studying biology and English there, and did a number of different, you know, nonprofit jobs after that. I worked for a refugee resettlement agency in Atlanta. I ran Boys and Girls Clubs for a while. And I thoroughly enjoyed working at the Boys and Girls Club, but I really wanted to get back into environmental issues. A lot of the like conservation ecology classes that I had taken at Berry had really moved me to focus more towards some of the policy issues and some of the, you know, psychology around, you know, how groups of people behave and how we can impact a community's behavior, you know, for the benefit of the environment and everyone's health. And so I had an opportunity to work for Ogeechee Riverkeeper as their outreach coordinator, and I jumped on it and haven't looked back since. And it's been really wonderful. A few years after working for Ogeechee Riverkeeper, I was offered the job to come back up here to Rome to take over Coosa River Basin Initiative, which I had served very briefly on the board before. And so here I am.
You're in it now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, I think you have a reading for us this morning, so I'll invite you to share that and then we'll dive in.
Yeah. So my reading, I don't know how long these readings usually are. When I was at Berry, I absolutely fell in love with a whole bunch of different authors, but one of the big ones that was the most impactful for me was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so this is just a short little excerpt from Nature. Get into it. Nature is a setting that fits equally well a comic or a morning piece. In good health, the air is a cordial of incredible virtue, crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune. I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his sloth, and at what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, master or servant, is then a trifle and a disturbance. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. And the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. Um, I love so much of Emerson's writing, and reading some of those pieces while at Berry was, obviously I expressed my love for that campus and how many opportunities you had to get away from everything, and to get into, areas of that campus where you could literally see no human impact, was just fantastic. And I love that piece. That's a piece that I come back to frequently, and had even been rereading and mulling over before we talked about this, because of recent political events and how polarizing and painful this year has been for many. And the reason why I do the work that I do is very much rooted in my connection to that writing, specifically preserving the healing nature of wild space. Um, and I really love the portions in that passage about, moving into that space and letting mean egotism, vanish. And some of the identifiers that we have, like your best friend's name or relationships that we have with other people, kind of melt into nothing. And the very last line is says that, when you can see all of nature, even the entire horizon, it comes almost as close to the beauty of the nature of being human. So, like, the whole piece is fantastic, but I think that it's really, really important for us to recognize the value of those wild spaces and the ability that it has to bring our minds to something greater than whatever is, bothering us at that time. And I know that that's always where I turn to find some level of peace, and to work to kind of empty my mind to find common ground with people that I might be, experiencing friction with, but just to, like, mentally be able to take a step back and reset that relationship in my own mind. I think is really important, and has been really important this whole year for me, for sure.
Yeah. Glad to the point of fear. It's a tall order in 2020.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole essay is absolutely fantastic. And so if you haven't gotten into Ralph Waldo Emerson's writings, I would encourage anybody to do so. He just has a way with words, and that piece goes on to just express some really beautiful ideas about, like he hints at there at the end, the beauty in human nature. And I think that right now, it's incredibly important that we remember that we really dig in, and in every single human being there is, this kind of spark of divine. There is, generosity, and there is, life, something worth cherishing and respecting. And it's really, if you're just like doom scrolling through your feed, it's really easy to like forget that, and take a stand by purging your Facebook friend list, and all of that stuff. And it's a lot more difficult to quiet your mind and make space for everybody.
Yeah.
And I love that about his writing, because I need that reminder.
Well, something about the piece and the way you've talked about the piece, I think in a pretty general sense, I would say has some holy strands in it. I think the way that it frames the world. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about how your own faith journey or faith generally kind of has informed your work on environmental issues, how that shapes the work that you do.
Yeah, I grew up in a very traditional conservative denomination, the Church of Christ, um, and for all of the theology that didn't stick into adulthood, I can say that I'm forever grateful for learning how to harmonize with the a cappella worship, which old hymns just still have like an incredibly prominent spot in like what taught my ear musically, and you know what music can do to kind of elevate our senses and take our mind out of day-to-day minutia, and pull it to something bigger. But um, I grew up with a bit of kind of discord between faith and environmentalism, uh, just because there weren't many examples in my life, as a child, that honored nature. The kind of terminology that's become more common in faith groups, creation care, that kind of thing, um, didn't really exist, at least not in my world, as a child. And so um, I think that is something that in my faith I always wrestled with, the confusion of, all of these people I know in their personal lives, very much enjoy nature, believe in nature, but almost as a matter of pride or necessity for their theological beliefs, like it was treated with such disregard. And there were scriptures used to suggest that like we had no responsibility to nature. We were just supposed to dominate it. And all of that sounded crazy to me. And I think um, like the older I got and the more I gained, my own critical thinking skills, the more I could reread passages and see like a deep, endearing respect for the natural environment, in passages that have been, I think, manipulated or misunderstood in my own faith upbringing. But the very like story just after creation where um, Adam and Eve like name all of the animals, which sounds insane, knowing how many species there are. But like the concept of identifying and like creating like the identity of each species is an incredibly intimate act. Like that's not something, like there's a reason why farmers don't let their kids name the,
Yeah.
the animals that are going to become food. Like that's a really intimate thing to do, to sit and name all of those things. And I think in my own upbringing, I had never seen that story through the lens of how much love that like imparted for the natural environment. Um, and now I very much love that story because it's so clear that that's not the behavior of humans that are expected to dominate nature. That is a task that was given to impart a deep rooted care. um, and so I think when I was able to kind of look at passages like that, it made things line up for me where there had felt like there was a disconnect.
Yeah. No, that's all really good. Um, so you're grounded in the Coosa River Basin, and just for a second, could you give everybody a little bit of a primer about what that is? What are some of the unique features, and what are some of the problems that you face there?
Yeah. So we work in the upper Coosa River Basin. So we have really a relatively short stretch of the Coosa River that is kind of in our jurisdiction. And there is another riverkeeper organization called Coosa Riverkeeper in Alabama. that takes over the Coosa, just downstream from Weiss Lake. But we do extensive work throughout all of the Coosa River's tributaries, including the Etowah, the Oostanala, Coosawhattie, and Conasauga rivers. And it's an incredibly biodiverse river system. So we have, I think by percentage, the most biodiversity of any basin in North America.
Wow.
And the Conasauga River, which eventually flows into the Oostanala, is this tiny, narrow little river. But it contains more individual species than all of the rivers in Europe combined. Just a wild array of very
Seems
colorful
important.
small fish. Yeah, all kinds of mussels, lots of federally and state listed species, both threatened and endangered. Um, and then there's, all of the people that rely on the surface water for drinking water. The city of Rome gets its water from a mixture of Etowah and Oostanala. And a lot of communities up and down these rivers rely on those as well. So I think in terms of some of the difficulties that we face are, some things that are common to a lot of the state. We're very much concerned about coal ash being stored right on the banks. We've had concerns about landfill failures that were also built right on the banks of the Etowah River, problematically. There's always development pressure, lots of erosion and sedimentation issues that crop up here or there. And then specifically in the Conasauga and Oostanala Basin, we're very concerned about PFAS, coming down from a lot of the carpet manufacturing, just legacy use of these chemicals, persist in the environment, and it's a big concern.
Yeah. Well, just briefly for our listeners that are tuning in that may not be familiar with PFAS, this is a chemical that doesn't break down naturally. It's in a bunch of different kinds of materials. Could you just briefly give a summary of that?
Yeah, sure. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They were developed and used for just tons of applications. Teflon, Gore-Tex, fast food wrappers, all kinds of stuff. And like any of those like Carnival packages, any time that you got something that was super greasy and it was wrapped in paper and the paper didn't just immediately disintegrate, was because of PFAS. So this is yet another great example of human ingenuity and short-sightedness. We have this propensity for creating things that we think are, some kind of miracle for our day-to-day lives, and then spreading them to all corners of the earth before recognizing, that there might be some issues with that. So there are a number of health concerns related to PFAS. It's considered an emerging contaminant. There's a lot of concern surrounding it, and there's a fair amount of growing medical evidence that there's certainly it can create birth defects and impact liver and kidneys and a whole host of problems can be associated with having high concentrations of this in your blood.
Exactly what you'd love to have in your water.
Yeah. And again, speaking to how widely used these chemicals were, most studies find that like more than 95% of the public already have it in their bloodstream at detectable levels. So we are behind If there is a concern about this contaminant, we miss the opportunity to control it,
Right.
which is really unfortunate and really important that EPA continue to move swiftly in addressing these and setting safe limits in drinking water, that kind of thing.
If ever a metaphor for the way environmental protections can go, 95% of people having it detectable in their bloodstream is definitely one of them.
Yeah, and it's incredibly unfortunate, and not to be alarmist, at all. We have incredible bodies that are resilient, and we have people who are working very hard to try and address these issues. So I'm not here to say that the sky is falling. I'm here to say this is a significant issue that we really do to work to address locally, nationally, and globally.
Well, you've highlighted some challenges, and we'll talk about some more environmental challenges later, but I want to take just a second to rejoice in some good news. In addition to being on the river, you spent a lot of time at the Capitol, a lot of time doing policy work. And for a long time, I think in conjunction with the Georgia Water Coalition, you've been working on trust fund honesty. And Amendment 1 was passed, Georgia Ballot Measure 1 was passed this last week. So talk about, what does that amendment get at? What was the problem? What's it going to solve?
Yeah.
And give just a really good, good on you. Everybody that worked on that.
This is absolutely a thrill. Not only to have passed it, which we expected that result, but the overwhelming margin. So 81.6% of voters in Georgia voted yes on Amendment 1, which is just like such a delight to be able to go to the General Assembly with such a clear mandate for voters. That is an enormous victory. So what's at issue is the way Georgia's Constitution was written. The General Assembly could create a fee by statute. So they could pass a bill and create a fee for anything that they wanted. And in the two fees that we were particularly interested in, the solid waste and hazardous waste trust funds, those fees were associated with tipping fees at the landfill to fund the hazardous waste trust fund, and the dollar fee that they attached to new tires for the solid waste trust fund. So since the 90s, Georgia citizens have been paying these fees that were supposed to fund specific projects. So they were supposed to clean up illegal tire dumps. They were supposed to pay for the cleanup of abandoned hazardous waste sites, abandoned landfills. They were supposed to help municipalities pay for problems at their local landfills, or help fund recycling programs, or law enforcement in areas where illegal dumping was happening. So clean
and
community.
That all happened.
So basically, all of these funds were being collected locally and then sent to the state government, to be entrusted. And those funds are supposed to come back into our communities and help clean them up, and that wasn't happening. So because of Georgia's Constitution, the General Assembly could create that fee, but they could not dedicate it. They couldn't protect that money. So that money, when it was collected, went into the general fund, and then appropriators, so the governor and some lawmakers, would decide the state's budget, and they would decide how much money those programs would get. And some years early on, those programs would be fully funded. It was working the way it was supposed to. Not always. And then 2008 hit. And after the financial collapse, the housing market, Georgia was in pretty dire straits in terms of its budget. And the General Assembly moved a lot of money away from those funds to pay for other parts of the budget, which I completely understand. The problem is they got really used to using that money for other things. And so once the economy bounced back, um, the appropriations into those programs did not. And so just millions and millions of dollars year after year, even after the economy was back and booming, um, millions of dollars being misappropriated and directed away from these programs. So the Amendment 1 basically changes the rules for how those fees can be created, and it gives the General Assembly the authority to dedicate those funds when they create them. So with that passed, we can now go back and introduce a bill in 2021 that says the solid waste and hazardous waste trust funds, hands off. These are for our communities, and the money has to be spent helping clean up our communities. That's really exciting.
That's very exciting. So how would something like, the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, could you give a little bit of an insight just quickly about how do you determine where to spend that money? How does the state determine where to spend that money? What sites to spend it on?
So there is a hazardous site inventory that EPD manages, and it's basically a list of all of the sites with known contaminated soil or groundwater. And the hazardous waste cleanup has been just painfully slow. Mitigation of like maybe 2 sites a year.
Wow.
And so the our hope is that with dedicated funding sources, those programs can be staffed up, and when there is a supply of cash on hand to help move these cleanups along, that will be met with some ingenuity and some growth in business sectors where more organizations can help staff those cleanups. And so that's our hope. And in terms of how they prioritize them, they have a whole kind of ranking system based on essentially the likelihood that the contaminants will come into contact with the public. And so that's essentially how they choose what they prioritize. But our concern has been how slow the process has been. I did just some digging through that hazardous site inventory as we were working on this legislatively for the last couple of years, and more than 75% of the abandoned hazardous sites have been on that inventory for 20 years or more. And so back into the 90s. So most of those sites are old enough to drink now, as they've just been sitting on that list waiting to be cleaned up. And it just seemed like that whole program was just going nowhere. It was going to take hundreds of years for us to get through that list of sites that we know are contaminated.
Right.
And each one of them is creating a drag on their own local economy. They're dragging down property values. They're, eating up developed real estate that could be redeveloped for something useful. So it's been a real problem, and we look forward to seeing that fixed.
Well, on the note of problems, for a while, we've worked on coal ash, and you obviously have worked on coal ash. A lot of people working on coal ash. And just a reminder to everybody, coal ash traditionally was stored in ponds, and there are hundreds of millions of tons of toxic coal ash waste from coal-fired power plants sitting around on the banks of lakes and streams and waterways in Georgia. And one of the problems that we're coming up against now is that kind of slated for 2020, 2021, is there's several coal ash ponds slated to being capped in place. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this community hearing about the plant share closure and down in Juliet. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about kind of how and some of the problems with capping in place, which we've talked a little bit about on this show before, but also kind of the importance of the process and community hearings, and why it's important for community voices to be heard in this decision-making process, and why people should be involved.
Yeah, I think I'll speak to that last question first. I think the the really important reason for engaging communities is these are not temporary measures that are being discussed. This is their permanent closure plan for those ash ponds. And so whatever is decided now, our communities are going to be grappling with, for decades to come, unless something catastrophic happens and it's readdressed in the future.
And if these
So
cap in place permits go through, then what we're talking about is kind of indefinite pollution of groundwater.
exactly. So the I think and I know that this has been addressed time and time again, and I'll just say it again because it bears repeating. They are proposing to cap and place ash ponds that they know are currently sitting in groundwater. So you have an unlined pond filled with coal ash, and they want to put an impervious surface on top and what they call advanced engineering techniques, which a lot of times is kind of driving walls down into the ground around the pond. But again, the bottom of that ash pond is unlined and is sitting in groundwater. So if water can move into that space, it can move out of that space, can take, carrying, chemical constituents of the coal ash, which is like just a total witch's brew of stuff that you don't want in your water.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, there are a number of other states that have provided a really clear example of how to do this much better. In fact, I believe it was in North Carolina during a court case there about coal ash. The company was saying, like, we want to cap these ponds in place without a liner because they're situated really well. They're high, they're away from waterways, they're not in groundwater. Like, we're not crazy. These are okay to cap in place. And here we are in Georgia. Like, I think the pond at Sheer, I don't remember which one it is, but one of the ash ponds that they're proposing to cap in place is sitting in 80 to 90 feet of groundwater.
Yeah.
Uh, which is just really, really insane.
And we know it's
But
possible for them to do it differently because they're
yeah,
excavating other ponds.
yeah. So their current plan is to excavate just under, I think it's just under half of their total coal ash in the state, and then cap in place half. But in every single instance where they have the plan to keep the coal ash in the pond that I'm aware of, that ash is either sitting in groundwater or frequently interacting with groundwater, that the
Yeah.
water table comes up into that ash frequently. And I think that's a problem. I think Georgia's communities deserve a better plan. That can't be our permanent closure plan for that. Toxic substance
Right.
that we know is a nuisance. We know it's a hazard.
Now, these community hearings, this is probably the best way for communities to get involved is to tune into these hearings, raise their voice, speak their piece.
Perhaps the only way.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, once these plans are approved, this is a permanent closure plan for these ash ponds. And so, yeah, if you are in or around one of these communities where a permit is coming up for a cap and place plan, please, please, please speak up, because this is your chance. This is your chance to express your displeasure with that plan.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about why people should get engaged in policy work, why people should raise their voice. Obviously, there's all sorts of policy wins that come with environment, and it's difficult to do environmental work without worrying about these systemic problems that can only be addressed through policy. Um, when Gordon Rogers was on, we talked a little bit about politics in Georgia, how it's changed over the years, where maybe it's going. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about how political work could be better and specifically referring to kind of what you've called like trench warfare style politics and perhaps some more constructive ways of doing policy negotiation. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it has been one of my greatest professional pleasures working with the Georgia Water Coalition, um, because of how much it's stretched the way I view political boundaries, and that has just grown to so many different things. Um, I mean, mention any subject, and there are people like deeply entrenched, on one side or the other.
Right.
Cats versus dogs, coffee versus hot tea. Like we have an incredible ability to fight about the dumbest things.
Very good at fighting.
And like I working in environmental policy in Georgia, we would get exactly nothing done if it wasn't from a bipartisan approach, and that can be incredibly challenging. It means that we are constantly compromising, and I frequently mention a lot of the heat that I get is from environmentalists. Like I will get some comments here or there from conservatives saying like you're killing jobs, but I'll also get a lot of heat from environmentalists who are pushing saying well, we're not doing enough,
Right.
these compromise, they want purity in the policy, and I think if I'm making everybody a little bit mad, I'm probably in a good place. And I just think that it's really important for us to, again, like go sit in nature and really work through these beliefs that we have about like the other side. Because the further we get into our own echo chambers, the more people we, unfriend, without a conversation. And I don't care about like unfriending. I'm more talking about our real relationships with people. The more we avoid those difficult conversations, the less we're going to get done. And that's just a fact. When we're talking past each other, I'm like, who has ever moved from one trench to the other trench? Like when we're all out on the field and conversing, we can move back and forth a little bit and we can understand where the other is coming from. But like, you're never going to get somebody who is just like zero fracking to be like, yes, let's frack everywhere all of the time, or vice versa.
Sure.
And so, like letting go of those purity tests and letting go of some of the like angry rhetoric and really working, really truly digging in and working to see the individual, that you're speaking to and work to find your common ground, because we all have it. And that's one of the things that's been really convenient in recent history is like, once upon a time, you were either pro-business or pro-environment, right? Like I'm thinking like back in the 70s, even into the 80s, 90s. But like those lines are evaporating in a lot of people's personal lives, right? Like you don't have to be one or the other. Most people want our environment to be protected. There are very few people that are out there like the villains of Captain Planet being like, no, my goal is to actively pollute. Like I want more pollution. I think, business people want clean water to, retreat to on the weekends and go fishing. Like, so as those lines blur in our private lives, we need that to be reflected in how we handle these conversations publicly. We have a desperate need for, civil discussion. And again, I'm really grateful for my work with Georgia Water Coalition because it's kind of just shoved me into that. You can't get anything done without it.
Right. Well, and it helps a lot to have people to buy into that. right? Like everyone has to buy into these solutions in order for them to work. And you can see kind of the power of doing that just based on even just the percentage for that ballot measure. That when
Yeah,
you do the work to build that kind of coalition and that movement, that you can get a whole lot of support for something that you might not have gotten otherwise.
absolutely.
Um, well, we're getting towards the end of our time here. I've got two more questions for you that we'll try to get through. Personally, I wanted to ask you a question to zoom us out a little bit, because I know that you had worked on for a refugee resettlement agency, and we haven't kind of dove into environmental justice concepts so much during this talk, but do you often think about the intersections between climate and environmental injustices and how that affects kind of refugee and immigrant populations, both here in Georgia, but everywhere?
Yes.
Yeah,
The word yes. I think I think it is really important to do that work. And I'll give a completely unrelated example just because it's been fascinating. Fascinating is a stretch. It's been interesting to watch, and a little painful to watch. But if you will look at employment statistics as we have worked through kind of an economic recovery from this pandemic, um, if you look at white men unemployment has dropped, from a high of, I don't remember how high it got, but it's back down to about 5%. And if you look at like any other minority group, it's still up around 9 to 12%. Women of color, African American males, it's still much higher. Um, and the reason why it's important to keep that in mind is what is considered like central, what is considered the majority, um, the white male experience will often guide policy. So if we stop our lens at, well, this one number is improving pretty greatly, we'll see this country has let a lot of help lapse. And I think that is in no small part to a majority group, a, a very much um, central identity group has done okay in the recovery. And so that gives, policymakers, if not cognitively, it gives them basically a ledge to stand on and say, no, we're doing okay. But what we're actually doing is leaving people behind. So I bring that up because it's a really salient statistic for right now that those unemployment numbers are very telling about how policy impacts the people that are at the center of society or in power,
right.
and can leave other groups behind. And that applies to everything. So the people that can afford to, live away from power plants, and the people that can afford to live outside of the floodplain, and the people who can afford to live, in these nicer environments are often the ones that have levers of power. So when we talk about the environment, when we talk about climate, the policy is stopping at a point where those people's properties are protected, but we're leaving behind, enormous populations across the globe, who are, becoming, we're seeing more and more, refugees of the environment, which is
Right.
truly bizarre.
Yeah.
And it's a direct result of our failure to keep pushing policy that includes everyone. So yeah, I think about that a lot.
Yeah, no, it's
Um,
helpful. I just wanted to do that and to zoom out, because I think it is exactly what you're saying. It's important that we, not only consider policies or even environmental policies that protect particular people over others, but there's sweeping issues that we have to focus on that affect different groups, particularly Black and Brown communities or immigrant communities or refugee communities, much differently and much harder than
yeah,
some white communities. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and if our policy work is not lifting everyone up, we're not doing enough. We've still got work to do until everyone is brought up to some form of equitable protection underneath, how we're working.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, thank you for coming on today. I'll ask you the final question, which is the same question that we've ended every interview with so far, which is, what are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world, and what's giving you hope to keep doing the work you're doing?
What do I miss most? That's really difficult. I'll answer that. I mean, obviously, face-to-face connection with people, um, especially in my community. So, like all of the things that have been, canceled, the Chiaha Harvest Festival locally, like all of the things where you got out into the community and just because of serendipity got to see an old friend that you hadn't spoken to in a while. Like all of those opportunities are just gone, and
Yeah.
that's that's getting tiresome.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's giving me hope, at least professionally, to keep doing what I'm doing is um, so much of this pandemic has forced people to get outside, and I think that it's going to help boost folks' attention to a lot of these really important issues and help get involved in protecting areas that they didn't necessarily know were threatened. Or addressing issues that they weren't necessarily aware of. But, I think every single environmental group has known this for a long time. The best way to create advocates is to get them out on the water, to get them outside in the space that you're trying to protect. Because all of a sudden, when they see it firsthand, when they get to know it, you can't go from that to then being ambivalent about whether or not it's taken care of. You just can't. So I think that gives me hope. A lot of people are getting outside, and I genuinely hope that translates to a lot more attention to these issues moving forward.
Well, great. Jesse, again, thank you so much for coming on the show and spending some time with us.